In this part of the lecture, we'll explore how censorship is implemented, both in terms of technical implementation as well as various non-technical ways that censorship can be carried out in practice. So how is censorship implemented? A conventional view of internet censorship is as follows. We have Alice and Bob who would like to communicate with one another over the internet, and there might be a part of the internet that is censored and another part of the internet that's uncensored, and some kind of censorship firewall in between them. That censor, who implements and deploys that firewall, may attempt to block traffic so that Alice and Bob can't communicate with one another. That censor might also directly try to punish a user if the censor observes that user behaving in a particular way, such as engaging in a particular type of speech, posting or publishing certain types of content, or even visiting certain websites. Censorship can be technically implemented in a variety of ways, including through protocol interference and manipulation, such as filtering of the lower layer internet protocols, such as the Internet Protocol, TCP, manipulation or poisoning of the domain name system, the system that resolves internet names to addresses, redirecting or blocking web pages, so-called HTTP or HTTPS redirection, and so forth. There are also ways for a censor to interfere with infrastructure. A censor might revoke or poison or somehow interfere with the registration of a domain name, revoke a certificate, making it impossible to communicate securely with a particular endpoint, or even resulting in the blockage or censorship of a particular endpoint or an internet route, or interference with the platforms, such as web hosting or content delivery. Increasingly, we're also seeing censorship being carried out on the platforms themselves, such as through social media or censorship via search results in a search engine. There are various technical points of control along an end-to-end internet path where censorship could be implemented. Censorship could be implemented by or at the behest of an internet service provider, either at the access network, in other words, the network that you buy internet service from, or somewhere in the middle of the internet, a so-called transit or backbone internet service provider. Content and publishing platforms and portals, as we've discussed, can also be levers for internet censorship. And the client endpoints themselves can also be mechanisms or points at which censorship can be implemented through the deployment of software on a particular endpoint, such as a smartphone, a tablet, or a laptop, or even instrumentation of the hardware itself. Let's take a quick look at how infrastructure censorship was implemented in the context of the Egypt shutdowns. In this case, the ISPs in Egypt acted on instructions from a judge or a government official to essentially remove the internet routes from the global internet routing table. In other words, the routers or the machines that forwarded traffic on the internet had no instructions about how to reach Egypt. And so, if traffic were destined for Egypt, or were coming from Egypt, destined for somewhere else, the routers on the internet had no way of processing that traffic and figuring out where to send it. This plot shows a timeline of 5 ISPs in Egypt and the number of internet routes that they advertised over time, and how quickly from a point in time at about 10 o'clock p.m. UTC, so about 10:30, Egypt went from completely on the internet to completely dark. Now, manipulation of the internet routes, or the so-called border gateway protocol, is not the most common way that internet shutdowns occur. But you can see here that if such a shutdown were implemented in this way, it can be implemented fairly quickly. And it also should give you a sense that there are many, many points of control where a censor can exercise control or censorship over the exchange of information online. There are various websites where you can learn more about widespread internet shutdowns, such as this one, which maintains records of internet shutdowns that are occurring in India. As I mentioned, widespread shutdowns that are countrywide are not all that common, but even in countries such as India, we can see that complete shutdowns often occur on a region-by-region basis. There are also non-technical forms of internet censorship, including self-censorship, whereby an individual who might say or publish content decides not to say something or not to publish that content, as well as various legal and policy-based mechanisms that governments can use to prevent content from being published or disseminated. Here in the United States, a couple of laws that have come into focus in this regard are the Communications Decency Act and the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. You might wonder what copyright has to do with censorship, and we'll see later on in this course how copyright laws can actually be used and abused to remove content from the internet and effectively implement censorship in certain cases. Self-censorship is the process by which someone who might say or publish something decides not to do so, usually out of fear of reprisal. This occurs in many countries, including in the United States. As you can see here, a particular war correspondent decided not to report on certain aspects of the Iraq War here in the United States. But this happens essentially all over the world, and one of the things that makes it very difficult to track is that it's essentially undocumented. It's very difficult to document the case of something not happening or someone not saying or not trying to communicate, whereas blocking is, of course, observable, as is takedown. And so self-censorship is a particularly difficult behavior to monitor or understand, particularly on a global scale. As I mentioned, censorship can also occur by law. As I mentioned, this happens in various countries around the world. You can see here an example of a South African law on copyright and concerns about how that law might be used to censor minority political parties. And a law that's particularly come into focus recently in the United States is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which essentially dictates whether and to what extent platforms that publish user-generated content might be liable for the content that their users post or host on their sites. There are various other fear and legal-based measures that countries use to censor or control online information, as you can see here.